and welcome to WashingtonTok. I'm Eun-jang Cho. North Korea tested a new ballistic missile designed to carry a super-large conventional warhead just days after unveiling its uranium enrichment facility. The U.S. slapped new sanctions on entities that facilitated illicit financial transactions between Russia and North Korea. Today, we discuss the U.S. strategy for dealing with North Korea's rapidly advancing nuclear threat.
To sit down and engage with the North Koreans. We do have some conditions. We will not accept North Korea as a nuclear.
I'm aware of the threat South Korea faces and fully understand my role, if confirmed, is in ensuring a constant state of readiness for all forces on the peninsula.
We urge Russia and the DPRK to immediately cease their unlawful cooperation.
In the studio with me, Mr. Anthony Ruggiero, Senior Director at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Mr. Ruggiero was the National Security Council Senior Director for Counterproliferation and Biodefense during the Trump administration. He was also NSC Director for North Korea. Also joining us, Dr. Adam Mount, Senior Fellow at the Federation of American Scientists. Previously, he was a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Mount was the project director of the Independent Task Force on North Korea at the CFR. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Dr. Mount, North Korea has recently unveiled a new 12-axle missile launch vehicle, suggesting development of a longer ICBM. It also unveiled uranium enrichment facility, which housed approximately 1,000 centrifuges. And scientists say nationwide there could be some 10,000 centrifuges, and that North Korea could have nuclear material that could produce 200 warheads by 2027. Now, Dr. Mount, is North Korea on track to increase its nuclear arsenal exponentially as Kim Jong-un has directed?
Well, certainly the North Korean arsenal is expanding dramatically, rapidly. It's diversifying. They no longer have an arsenal that's solely committed to retaliate against an attack against Kim Jong-un or the regime. They're now developing capabilities that are useful for escalation management in limited conflicts, so limited strikes and coercion of South Korea and the United States, as well as you say, more capable, heavier, longer-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. So North Korea has outstripped many of those thresholds where they had a liminal capability, but we weren't quite sure about their level of technical development. They're now at the stage where the United States, as a matter of policy, needs to assume that North Korea could strike at the continental United States with intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Mr. Ruggiero, 2024 Republican and Democratic platforms didn't mention the goal of denuclearizing North Korea, but Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell said in a Senate hearing that we're willing to sit down and engage with the North Koreans, but we will not accept North Korea as nuclear state. Now, you're a senior policymaker at the White House. The U.S. government may officially state that we will denuclearize North Korea, but unofficially, behind the scenes, don't you think U.S. government officials are sharing views that it is impossible to denuclearize North Korea?
Well, I think when you're a senior policymaker, whether it's in the departments or in the White House, you don't look at North Korea just in a vacuum alone. And so that's part of the issue of why we're maintaining our desire to denuclearize North Korea. We have other countries like Iran that's on the threshold of a nuclear weapon. South Korea, perhaps we'll talk about it later, South Korea wants nuclear weapons. There are other countries like Saudi Arabia that wants its own enrichment program and has openly talked about matching Iran. So we have to look at North Korea in the context of non-proliferation and proliferation more broadly. I'll also say that when we have these debates over whether it should be denuclearization or arms control or threat reduction or whatever we want to call it, number one, North Korea doesn't want to talk to us right now. So that's a big problem. So regardless of what our goal is for negotiations, there are no negotiations. Number two, we don't really have a sanctions program that provides us any leverage against North Korea. So when people say, well, we'll just lift sanctions and we'll get some great deal, there's no lifting of sanctions that the North Koreans are going to accept in response to that. And number three, all of those three different scenarios require a large apparatus to verify that North Korea is abiding by those. And so, to me, if we're going to do that, we might as well go for the big denuclearization as opposed to these sort of smaller steps that will still take all of that requirements to achieve them. But the most important part is two to tango takes two to tango. And we're the only ones that are interested in talking. North Koreans are not interested right now.
And Dr. Mount, you said that since there's little possibility of disarming North Korea in the foreseeable future, South Korea and the United States should seek to coexist peacefully with nuclear North Korea. Now, there are a lot of skepticism about that possibility. Can you talk briefly about how that scenario might look like?
Sure. Yeah, unfortunately, managing a nuclear-armed North Korea is the only tolerable and feasible option, as far as we can see. North Korea will remain a nuclear-armed state. The United States, for many years, decades, had an objective of preventing this eventuality, but now the day is here. And so we can debate about how to phrase US and alliance objectives. I don't think denuclearization is quite the right word, but the important thing is, in private, behind the scenes, we have a recognition that North Korea will retain its nuclear arsenal, worry less about wordsmithing in public, and develop a sustainable long-term strategy to deter a nuclear-armed North Korea, contain its technology, its malign influence, criminal activity to the peninsula, constrain its ability to build up without limits and aggress and spread its influence around the world, and then to find a way to gradually shape the transformation of North Korea in ways that conduce to a more stable and prosperous Northeast Asia.
So if North Korea retains its nuclear weapons, it will not match United States in any way in terms of military strength. Mm-hmm. But for South Korea, the goal of keeping North Korea as is may stoke fears of abandonment in the alliance dilemma. And wouldn't South Koreans want to get their own nuclear weapons if United States publicly states that we're just going to accept North Korea as is?
Well, there's no chance that the United States will formally accept North Korea as a nuclear power. It's not even clear what that would mean.
But you said we should seek coexistence with nuclear North Korea.
Yes, North Korea is going to retain its nuclear arsenal. And unfortunately, there's nothing that we can do about that in the near term. Rather than build the alliance on a fiction that we can take this unattainable step, we need to face facts and within the alliance recognize that we have an exceptionally strong deterrent of North Korea. Our conventional forces, both the United States and South Korea's, and US nuclear forces far outmatch anything that North Korea could hope to develop in the next century. So recognizing that the cornerstone of our deterrent is strong is the first step in developing the sustainable strategy towards North Korea in the foreseeable future. For South Korea to break its commitments to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and initiate a nuclear weapons program would be an enormous mistake for South Korea and for US interests. It's not necessary to deter North Korea. and it would expose South Korea to threats, intimidation from its neighbors, preemptive strikes from North Korea, sanctions, economic costs.
You say it'll be a mistake for South Korea, but what I'm asking is that if United States say that North Korea can keep its nuclear weapons, wouldn't that trigger South Koreans to want to have nuclear weapons? That was my question.
Public opinion will be what it is. And I think the goal for US officials and for South Korean officials is to transform South Korean public opinion, to educate South Korean citizens about the strength of the alliance and the solidity of our deterrent posture, and to try to tamp down these popular sentiments.
Mr. Ruggiero, you're a non-proliferation, counter-proliferation expert. I want to hear your views about whether it's better to seek peaceful coexistence with nuclear North Korea or to strengthen deterrence and warn against the leader about the possible use. Do you also think, like some people, that the warning that if North Korea uses nuclear weapons, that will be the end of the regime? Do you think that's a mistake, or is that effective warning against the country?
Yeah, I think that's the right approach for right now in terms of deterrence and making clear that while North Korea has nuclear weapons, that there are consequences for use and for those nuclear weapons. I guess I was sort of trying to think through some of what Adam's saying. I agree with, where we can build deterrence and we can try to contain and address some of North Korea's what we used to call illicit activities. We can do all of that, and we can do all of that. I guess, in terms of like having an unofficial understanding that North Korea will continue to stay nuclear, I think the concern there from my perspective is that South Korea, as you noted, I don't think it's going to be they're going to race to a nuclear weapon. In fact, I think South Korea would probably take a page out of something like Iran or even North Korea, and building out their quote unquote civilian nuclear program and starting to do some of the weaponization and weapons related work covertly to give them that option, the sort of shrinking that timeline to months instead of years or whatever it is now. And then the issue becomes, then we cannot convince Iran to move in the right direction. So then we have another failure on the rogue state. And then we're going to have a enrichment program in Saudi Arabia. And then we're going to have that conversation with the UAE and others. And so this is the true snowball that we will, I think at some point in the Cold War it was predicted we'd have a lot more nuclear weapon states. This is the way to get there, is to not handle North Korea correctly. Unfortunately, we've failed in the last 30 years. It would be better if we were in a better position, but we're just not, unfortunately.
So you're saying South Korean decision about whether to go nuclear is largely influenced by U.S. stance on denuclearizing North Korea?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but also it's related to what are we actively doing. I think this administration right now is very focused on the deterrence and military aspect and not doing the other two legs of the stool. The diplomacy aspect, you mentioned, it's not even in the platforms, and the economic, which I know we'll talk about the sanctions themselves later, but that economic pressure is just frankly not there. I mean, if Kim was under pressure, he would not be helping Putin with his war in Ukraine. That's just a fact. And because he's doing it means that he feels more comfortable, and he knows that there's not going to be more pressure coming, at least from this administration.
Dr. Mount, North Korea has consistently reneged on its agreements with the United States on nuclear issues. And you say that U.S. should focus on North Korea's tactical nuclear arsenal in disarmament negotiations. How can this be effective given North Korea's track record? And even if North Korea appears to engage in such talks of disarming the tactical nuclear weapons, wouldn't its ICBM and strategic nuclear weapons capabilities continue to grow?
Yeah, the first thing to recognize is that Anthony's right, that North Korea has shown no indication of coming to the table in the near future. That having been said, it's prudent for South Korea and the United States to develop a negotiating position in case they do. My argument has been that the first priority for the United States and South Korea and other allies is to address North Korea's tactical nuclear arsenal. These are, in some ways, the most dangerous nuclear weapons in the world. They're the likeliest to be used.
Mr. Ruggiero, as Dr. Mount said, if negotiations starts, do you think tactical nuclear weapons should be the first thing to discuss with North Korea?
Well, I mean, we've tried this before. I mean, I was there for the six-party talks, and there was a strategic decision to focus on the plutonium program, even though we knew that North Korea had a production style or production scale enrichment program, and that they were moving in that direction. This is during the George W. Bush administration. So this is not partisan. So that was a strategic decision that they made. And what did that get us? That got us a deal that got us further down the line, but North Korea just ran out the clock in the latter half of the second George W. Bush term. And they built a nuclear reactor in Syria covertly, so that Syria could build nuclear weapons on its own and have its own covert nuclear program. So I just think that I go back to, for me, it's a process and resources question. If we're going to negotiate a deal where we're going to give away whatever leverage we have, whether that's from deterrence and or sanctions, and then we're going to focus solely on one element of their nuclear program, that's going to be resource intensive for the U.S. government and for our other governments, that I think we should just go for the whole thing. I haven't been convinced that just a sliver, because that's essentially what we've done since the agreed framework, is all of these interim deals in the hopes that we'd get a bigger deal, and that hasn't worked. So, the big for big is still my preference, but we're nowhere near that.
Mr. Ruggiero, North Korea is rapidly advancing its nuclear arsenal, and you recently wrote about China's nuclear breakout. And more people in Washington endorsed the idea of reintroducing U.S. nuclear tactical weapons into the theater to check against North Korea and China's nuclear threats. And U.S. Forces Korea Commander nominee General Brunson also said that Kim could use nuclear weapons in an attempt to deter United States or United Nations Command member countries from becoming involved in a conflict on the North Korean peninsula. Do you think it's prudent that United States should reintroduce U.S. nuclear tactical weapons into the theater?
Yeah, I don't think we need to do things like that right now. I don't think we need to agree to South Korea's requests if they have future requests on their nuclear program that moves them closer to the threshold. I do think that we're overdue for a broader conversation about where nuclear proliferation in particular is going. And my hope is that whichever side wins, that'll be a large part of it, because when you look at all the estimates for China in terms of getting over 1,000 deployed nuclear warheads by 2030 at least, that's going to be, if Vice President Harris wins, that potentially could be in, if I'm doing my math correctly, in her second term. So, she really needs to think through that, as does former President Trump if he wins. And there's a lot of different parts of this. So I'm reluctant to just have this conversation with South Korea and say, yes, you should have tactical nukes, or yes, you should be doing reprocessing or enrichment or whatever their request is, without really having the conversation about, because I believe that the last 20 years we've been trying to prevent North Korea and Iran from getting nuclear weapons to mixed success, to put it diplomatically, and the next 20 will be focused on our allies and partners really wanting to move in that direction too.
Dr. Mount, you said a military posture of the U.S.-South Korea alliance exceeds the requirements of deterrence and maintains unnecessary high risk of North Korean nuclear use. So are you suggesting that U.S. and South Korea should downgrade their deterrence on par with North Korea so that North Korea doesn't use its nuclear weapons?
Absolutely not. No, what it means is that the United States has this margin of advantage that's enormous. And that's a major advantage for the United States and for South Korea. I don't think we need to take shortcuts. So as far as South Korea has relied on threats to decapitate the North Korean regime, and we have this declaratory policy about ending the North Korean regime, it deprives us of flexibility in a crisis and increases the risk that Kim Jong-un will perceive himself as being personally under attack, which is the triggering event that could cause him to employ his forces. I think that's unnecessarily risky. Because the United States and South Korea have this huge margin of advantage, we can afford to have confidence in that margin, and to be the party on the peninsula that accepts stability and that recognizes that we can achieve our objectives regardless of what North Korea does. We don't necessarily have to threaten the regime in any specific circumstances, and we don't necessarily have to threaten Kim Jong-un's life to do
Well,
that.
Kim Jong-un is the one who does threatening all the time. Mr. Ruggiero, Deputy Secretary Campbell said that North Korea is about the most heavily sanctioned country in the world. We've still added on a few sanctions as a result. And you pointed out several times on our program and over the years that the United States is not fully using all the powers that it can to cut the revenue streams for North Korea. But in the meanwhile, over the years, North Korea's nuclear capabilities has enhanced, and Russia is now more supporting North Korea than ever. Under the circumstances, are there any viable sanctions left? And does the pressure need to be increased?
Sure. I mean, that line about being the most sanctioned country, that seems to never die. I mean, many of us, there's some of others who've done this as well, really trying to rank them. But it's, quantitative and qualitative when you look at the sanctions and the ones they did recently this week. I'm always in favor of going after the financing of these proliferation networks. But when you look at what they did, number one, it's not even clear that that's an active network, because they said it was active almost a year ago, so in late 2023, and they used the past tense in a lot of the points in their release, and it looked like it was an internal network inside of Russia. And so it didn't really answer the questions of how is North Korea getting that money back, or are they buying commodities inside of Russia that they're sending back to North Korea, or are they sending that to China? So there's a lot of unanswered questions, which would lead to, again, they went after a node in a network and not the network, which is not the right way to do it. And I've said it many times at this table that our approach is completely misguided. There is a way to do this. You go after the revenue, you go after what they're making money for, you make Kim uncomfortable where he is. He is very comfortable. He's walking around in centrifuge plants and doing missile tests and sending things to Russia that they are relying on for their war in Ukraine. I just don't, for me, it's hard to square this administration's stated strong support for Ukraine and then their inability to peel off North Korea and Iran helping Russia. It baffles my ability to make sense of it. Those two countries would be easy enough for the Treasury Department to spend a couple of days just dismantling the networks that they're using. And they've decided to use this piecemeal approach that is not going to work.
So in order to go after the network and not just the node and not just check the box, all United States is more resources and time to just really look into this matter.
Well, I mean, it's a willingness. They know what the network looks like. It's, when you do, I've written many sanctions packages, I've coordinated them, I've done all of that work. You know what the entire thing looks like, and then you can decide where you want to go. And their decision so far has been to roll these things out in slow succession, but only focusing on a small part of it. And it does not track with their policy of supporting Ukraine and protecting the Ukrainian citizens who are being killed by these things that Iran and North Korea are sending to Russia. Like, this is not a theoretical conversation. It's a real life war in Europe. And the fact that this administration has not essentially dismantled North Korea and Iran's ability to help Russia is baffling. And I think when you hear Republicans in the campaign talk about, well, we should be doing a lot more to help do these things, that's what they're talking about, that this administration has only been doing half-hearted efforts to both support Ukraine and go after North Korea and Iran and Russia.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Dr. Mount, Mr. Ruggiero, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.